the spirit of blood. 3 days later, when the men's unconscious bodies were untied from the whipping post, they were taken back to their old quarters and tent groups for recovery. Upon awakening, the men were still living with the pain of punishment, but each agonizing moment only reminded them of a feeling they felt saved from. Neither man truly thought of one another upon waking, not in the seconds, minutes, or even days that passed. The men would occasionally find themselves thinking of the other punished, only to remember the blurry sight of the other as blood was sprayed at each blow, immediately making them remember their own pain. The memories of rage towards the other were dull and numb, as those thoughts of what it was like to fight each other were replaced by the stinging recollection of the whip. Over the following days, the legionaries left under the Interfector's command were still waiting for fresh soldiers and a relief force to come and take over the assimilation of the Ajoans. Still stuck in their place, the amount of losses the Legion sustained against the Ajoans made it impossible to escort the fallen tribals into Legion affiliation or begin marching to bolster the Arizona campaign's other forces in the southeast. At this time, the Interfector soldiers had nothing to do but watch over the prisoners and wait with an incredibly understrength force. All the while, the duelists were only able to focus on recovery, and the waiting facilitated that and the other exhausted legionaries under the bull banner fine, at least for the moment. The display at the whipping post was in front of everyone, prisoner and Legion alike. The Interfector personally saw that moment as a chance to finally show the soldiers under his command that he was in fact Legion. As mentioned earlier, the current primus of the 6th, 5th, and 9th was something of an unknown even up to this point in the Ajoan campaign. His reputation preceded him before taking his new charge in Gold Canyon, and his initial sparing of the duelists months earlier brought up many questions from the centurions under his authority. The questions came from the legend of a monster who destroyed a metropolis, coupled with the actions of a rather timid man who spared 2 disobedient officers from a Legion-justified punishment. None of the commanders who saw his mercy back in Gold Canyon knew what to make of that action, but were never able to question him based on his mysterious yet terrifying reputation. After the losses in battle showed what could be considered a miscalculation in the man's tactical abilities, the murderer was clearly not very used to leading parts of Legion campaigns, something the man himself was well aware of. However, that was also an idea he intended to counter, and his way of showing who he was arrived in what he did to Aileron and Montano. Almost begging his men to save themselves from the punishment, the murderer knew he couldn't change what was ingrained in them or alter their nature. He learned this upon hearing the words of Aileron. In the face of defiance that will not die, the only thing one can do is join it or perish. The Interfector tried to kill the duelists' feud with mercy, but finally learned how his new world demanded blood in all forms. No exceptions, a caveat to a system he himself needed to understand and formally carry out. Still, as he'd heard so many times over the past months, he was the word of Caesar to his forces, and though he succumbed to the Legion standard of authority, he knew Caesar personally and knew that his enemies, sometimes even temporary enemies, could be the perfect allies given the proper circumstance. Since the duelists were properly punished and put back into the Legion ranks, the killer was not above recognizing their value and even granting new authorities to them. Given the depleted and battered state of his centuries, one day while the Interfector soldiers were still waiting, word came down to both Aileron and Montano regarding their reassignments. Though the killer was confident he had destroyed both men's feud at the whipping post, he felt it also necessary to separate the two. Not only was this a preventative measure for possible future conflicts between the two, but this reassignment also served the purpose of consolidating his forces. Of the 300-plus legionaries and tribal auxiliaries to have followed in the Interfector's campaign, only a little more than 100 were ready or still recovering. The rest were killed. Because of this, the commanders of the 6th, 5th, and 9th issued out their promotions to the soldiers they sought fit to fill the roles of the killed. With that, the Interfector made it a special point to directly oversee the futures of Montano and Aileron. Upon discussion with Centurion Theracos of the 6th, the murderer accepted the recommendation to take Aileron away. Veteran Decanus Aileron was taken into the personal guard of the Centurion elite himself to fill a battle-sustained gap. With the other Centurions losing members of their staffs as well, Centurion Theracos had one of the spots in his staff filled by Montano. It should also be mentioned that Montano took the spot of a different member of the staff, not the one made by Alaron's transfer. This was done so to prevent any potential feelings of superiority or resentment. Either way, Therakos was saddened to lose one of his best staff officers and one of his best veteran infantry commanders. The transfer was strange for Montano, specifically who knew how to read, write, and do basic math, but was not familiar with the administrative duties of a staff member. Still, neither man could do much other than wait and heal in the days after their beating. By the third day after the duelist's punishment, a full week had passed since the Ajoans were defeated. Now, the Ajoans had heard stories from scouts and other tribal allies about what happens when the Legion conquers an enemy, and many still in the pens began wondering why they hadn't left the pens in a week. Disease was spreading, food was scarce, many had died since being set aside for a life of slavery, and many were wondering what exactly their conquerors were doing. It was around the time the duelists were punished when word was covertly spread throughout the pens how the Legion force was awaiting backup. The captives didn't know that their subjugators were barely able to keep hold of what they had until connecting two and two. Although many of the Ajoans sick, elderly, weak, and infirm were killed after the first night and days of assessment, the slaves of the tribe still numbered close to 1,000. Even as many behind the wire were dropping from disease and lack of sustenance, the word of impending reinforcements made those hastily constructed pens look more and more escapable. Several Ajoans had tried to run in the time since the whipping, but the Interfector's special display didn't impact the Ajoans the way he thought it would. Many captives were still beaten for the smallest disobediences, but what the Ajoans saw the Legion do to their own 2 men seemed small when their tribesmen and women were found dead several times a day, lying dead in their own excrement, dehydrated, but still free from a life of slavery. It was only the living Ajoan captives who saw their futures in the image of Alaron and Montano. With that image in mind and word of more Legion forces approaching, many began believing it was now or never. The trouble in the pens was small at first. Many defiant acts only started out as simply obstructing the legionaries who entered to cart away the dead, or hostile shouting in the Ajoans' language. Over the hours and days of idleness and miserable endurance, many Ajoans thought that any day could be the day Legion backup would arrive. With the tension rising, the Ajoans would begin assaulting the occasional pair of legionaries, and that always escalated to a brutal squashing of the resistance. Offending mothers were forced to watch their children killed before getting the blade themselves, and defiant men had their spouses taken away for ravaging, all to quell a fiery spirit that only grew when the light of hope fell dimmer. By the third day after the whipping, Alaron and Montano were able to walk and assist in their duties, many of which were just checking up with the soldiers under their charge and transitioning to their new assignments. Both men still couldn't walk around in full armor, and even the fibers on their red tunics stung against their bandaged backs. But the 2 were born again after the whipping post and Legion through and through, so the pain was only a motivator. Since heading into battle was impossible for the entire unit, the only true work the 2 needed to do in the waiting was just standard manual responsibilities that came with any Legion unit. Something still relatively easy to do without padded steel and hardened plastic armor. With Alaron still adapting to his position on the Interfector's guard, that third day was when he learned what it meant to be constantly around the man. It meant that Alaron would know what was happening. Alaron was used to knowing things the average legionary didn't through time on Therakos' staff, but in this particular situation, Alaron learned on that third day that the reinforcements were only another day out. Now, it is unknown how or if the Ajoan captives learned this news through overheard talk, or if what happened was mere coincidence. However, it was in the afternoon of that third day when the tension of the situation snapped. The low cauldrons of slop for the slaves were brought out, and the crews of legionaries entered each pen, one by one, to little protest. That was hardly a moment that trouble normally came, and it all happened peacefully for each of the pens until the final one. The last and 4th largest slave pen, the one full of adult males to be sent to Legion soldier camp, was the one that took the chow as a time to move. Upholding the order of distance till the final second, the 2 legionaries to drop off the sustenance bucket had their exit from the pens cut short as dozens of military-age former Ajoans rushed the 2. Before the event could even be processed, several shots were fired from the 2 outnumbered legionaries, and their blades had been ripped from them before they could even reach for them. The guards observing outside the wire panicked at the abduction's suddenness and fired a few shots into the warrior pen before halting. When the dust settled, 2 legionaries in nothing but their tattered uniforms were stripped of their armor, rendered weaponless, and being constrained by several Ajoans. It was unknown if the Ajoans had intentionally created a hostage situation, or even if they knew how the Legion handled hostages. Nevertheless, the gunshots and shouting brought many more legionaries to the scene, who all surrounded that pen with guns and throwing spears at the ready. Unsurprisingly, this gathered the attention of the officers who had no intention of entertaining even the meagerest of demands. Montano was at the scene from the start, helping organize the slave rations as a new part of Therakos' staff, which had been assigned supervision over the task. The shots and sounds of chaos gathered Montano and his new senior Gula, who directed all the legionaries and guns who approached the scene. On the other hand, Alaron approached the troubling sounds behind the Interfector and his new comrade in the personal guard, Dalton. Behind them was Therakos, seemingly mortified that any incident could happen under the supervision of his staff. At the scene, the Interfector saw the situation in the warrior pen, looked to the row of guns around it, saw Gula and Montano directing the soldiers, and knew what to do. All was silent in the encampment when the Interfector shouted, "What's going on?" A tribal holding a machete from one of the restrained legionaries shouted, "We have you men. We kill them." The Interfector took particular notice of the abducted legionaries still struggling in their bondage, and nodded before shouting, "You're gonna kill them if you don't get freedom or what? Proud of you boys. Keep struggling." The tribal in charge shouted back, "Yes, let us go." The Interfector chuckled to himself, seemingly amazed at the simple and illogically proportioned demands, yet stern seriousness in delivery. He shouted back, "You understand I won't let 1,000 of you Ajoans go for 2 of my guys, right? Like, I'd still hate to kill all of you in there. But you know I'm not above that, right?" "Yes," was the response from the warrior prisoners. It wasn't known whether or not the response from the Ajoans was just a language barrier, or if this was just a sad attempt at control over an inevitable end. Still, the answer was yes, and so the Interfector did the only thing he could. He turned to the man at his side and said, "Centurion Therakos, your staff are overseeing afternoon slave chow. Take care of this, would you?" "Of course, Primus." The Interfector asked Alaron to see him in an hour as the elite stepped away with Prime Dalton. Therakos told Gula to carry it out, and Decanus Gula shouted at the encircling legionaries. Therakos walked off to strategize for future battles, and Alaron approached the pen as the guns fired at everyone inside the wire. One of the hostage legionaries was killed somewhere between the hail of bullets or by one of the Ajoans, but the other one was just cut up a little bit and slept in his contubernum's tent that night. As the guns stopped and the dust settled, the warrior pen went from around 180 captives to around a little less than 150, most of whom weren't even seriously wounded, so it wasn't quite the grand massacre. Many of the Ajoans fled to where they could in the pens as the shots came, and there were still plenty of new bodies in the sand to end whatever that situation was. With the sun lowered a little more, the many legionaries who arrived at the trouble had left. However, there were still over 30 legionaries from the unit's different centuries who were commandeered for the aftermath. Gula and Montano ordered their troops into the pens to pile the dead and slay any of the mortally wounded. The corpse pile was to be burned within the pen as a reminder of where defiance will get you. As the bodies were piled and the prisoners kept at bay, the Ajoans' captives were rapidly forgetting what happened to their friends minutes earlier and remembering that ferocity towards the Legion. The Ajoans were packed into one side of the pens, kept at distance by legionaries with guns, but their shouting and swearing in tribal tongue and mixed English grew louder and louder as each body was added to the pile. When it came down to it, many of the Ajoans' fragmented insults were calling the legionaries cowards for killing them with guns while they were defenseless, something many of the masked legionaries in those pens nodded to in acknowledgement and legitimate agreement. Alaron felt his hands reaching for his blade as he watched from outside the wire. His eyes looked around where he saw Montano speaking with Gula beside the corpse pile. Montano still just wearing a wrapping around his torso when Gula overheard something amidst the cowering, angry faces. What exactly Gula heard got carried into the sea of slurs and insults being shouted in broken English, but it still caught Gula's attention enough for him to storm towards the prisoners. Many heard him when the crowd died, and veteran Decanus Gula of the 6th shouted in cackling and nearly indecipherable anger. "Whatever's practical. I'll give an Ajoan my place. All you gotta do is bow so I could kill." That is believed to be what he said. Gula was known to be quite an eloquent yet loud and commanding man, but whatever was said earlier caused him to shout something nearly incoherent at the Ajoan warriors, according to all Legion accounts there. That didn't matter though, since the Ajoans were still silent and seemingly very well aware of what message was delivered. All this came to make sense when a giant Ajoan, a former warrior who was forced to surrender, and probably the ringleader behind the afternoon's event, stood up. Stepping over the sitting warrior captives and towards Gula, the man was naturally large, about the size of Gula, who was maybe an inch or two shorter than the tribal without armor. As the warrior stepped up, he said in accented English for all to hear, "Agreed. Can't wait to wear that helmet." Just like that, Alaron entered the pens and took a spot on the opposite side of a forming ring, pistol in hand, and across from Montano as Gula and the tribal walked up. Not one legionary to see it that day knew why Gula ordered the legionaries to form a circle, at least not until Gula began removing his armor and heard the tribal ask sarcastically, "Not even gonna give me a weapon?" Some don't even believe Decanus Gula knew or realized that Alaron and Montano were both there at the scene when he unhooked his blade and tossed it to the tribal giant. Gula had finished removing his armor, even taking off his red tunic, exposing a muscular back covered in scars and marked in dust like he'd recently crawled from a grave. The line of guns watching the other warrior captives almost wasn't needed, since all were focused and silenced by what was happening 30 yards away. Gula had finished stripping himself of all protection and picked up the large fire axe he'd been known to use as his signature weapon in battle. Standing back up, he turned and faced the giant who was studying the fine but rusty blade he'd been given. When the tribal looked to Gula, the veteran Decanus said, "No mercy, savage," in his flat but clear-toned command voice, having all but recovered completely from the sputtering rage a minute earlier. The Ajoan warrior captive nodded with a grunt, and one of the legionaries in the ring shouted, "Begin." The Ajoan dashed towards Gula terrifyingly fast for a guy his size, and darted to the side in an attempt to dodge the calculated first swing, clearly skilled in one-on-one combat. Still, before the giant could blink or knew what happened, his life had ended. Gula stepped on the skull of the man and cranked the heavy axe blade out of the smashed cranium, dislodging the blade. The sound of crumbling bone was heard in the silence as Gula lifted his axe to study the steel. Gula apparently didn't find what he was looking for in the bits of brain and blood on the axe, so he brought the axe down again. Then again. Then again. Gula smashed and hacked away at the already destroyed skull of the opponent until there was nothing but a pile of matter where the man's head used to be. All the while, the warrior slaves, encircling legionaries, and slaves in the other pens watched in silence. Silence, even as the victor dropped to his knees, began picking through the mess and tasting parts he found edible. Spattered in the remains of the giant Ajoan, Gula finally begun splashing the blood from the giant's leaking neck stump onto his face and arms like he was bathing in it. Breathing heavily and lightly chuckling all the while, he even ensured he covered the vital areas as he scooped more handfuls of blood to pour over himself. When Gula was finally covered in enough blood, he began licking the blood off his hands until he again had his fill, drenched in the blood of the pulverized and consumed. When Gula was done, he was on his knees looking into the sunset, and not even the wind made a sound. Though he couldn't remember in the moments before, during, or immediately after, Gula wasn't always Legion. Gula was 27 years old at the time, and couldn't honestly tell anyone what his life was like before the age of 15. The first 15 years of his life had never even happened in his eyes. He could tell you about the first man he killed for Caesar at the age of 16. But that would be a lie if he stated that to be the first life he took. Decanus Gula was, is, and always will be Legion. Since marching into his first battle for Caesar at age 16, he lived, breathed, ate, and slept Caesar. The lives he himself personally ended since that age were too many to count, but all of them were in the name of the Legion. Although I mentioned that Gula had lived a life before Caesar, a life that was again almost unknown to him. Gula was born and raised in the Bloodsands tribe, an Arizona tribe that inhabited the unclaimed part of the Sonoran Wastes between the Sedonas and Atomic Stalkers north of the Phoenix Valley, back when those tribes weren't yet consumed by the bull. Living in the mountains and deserts in the place where the sands turned steadily to blasted woodlands, the Bloodsands were the kind of people to believe if they could spill enough blood across the lands of their enemies, the blood would be evaporated into the clouds and rain down on faraway lands that marked their next target. Chasing the storm clouds across northern Arizona, his tribe was a terror to so many in the northern wastes. That was until they entered Legion territory and were promptly annihilated, but not before savaging the cohort they come across. Merciless and psychotic, Gula learned to love and revel in the sight of blood at a young age. Having been taught by his father at the age of 7 on how to skin a Bloodsands captive, his entire life was erased not long after the Legion detained his teenage self following the destruction of his tribe in their suicidal assault on the forces of Caesar. The man had spent the rest of his life living for Caesar and Caesar alone. What he did to that Ajoan giant after the action was a reversion to his tribal self, almost like an instinct that took him over. He'd always loved spilling the blood of those who opposed Caesar, but the mess he made in the fight with the Ajoan, and how he played in it like a child, was something foreign to him. Feeling himself acting autonomously, he knew not to stop until he covered himself in all the blood, and noticed how good it felt despite not even knowing what was happening. As he stared out into that sun, covered in remains, his forgotten life had not consumed him. The spirit that manifested in him took on a new shape just as the sun was almost gone. The words, "Glory to Caesar," escaped his lips only loud enough for few in the circle to hear. Immediately after the sun was just a glow in the west, Gula hopped back up. Walking to his end of the circle, he began casually picking up his discarded pieces of armor and re-equipping himself as if nothing happened. The circle of legionaries was still around him, and the Ajoans throughout the camp were still silent when Gula looked up from fastening a shin plate and said, "Add him to the pile." Gula gave the order to clear out as another team of legionaries poured alcohol on the pile of bodies. The line of guns filed out of the pens, and Montano and Aileron joined the gaggle of exiting legionaries. Although, it was just before the circle formally disbanded that Decanus Gula caught the eyes of Aileron and Montano. Upon catching both of them in his shifting gaze, he said to both of the lingering men, "Mars gives me the blessing too. Try killing them instead of one another." Both men heard that, and neither were sure of what that meant exactly. Aileron and Montano caught each other's eye again for the first time since the whipping post, and immediately turned at the stinging memory of their injuries. Gula, Montano, Aileron, and the rest of the afternoon incident's cleanup crew left the pens. The sky was dark until the final departing legionary tossed a match on the corpse pile, giving the men in the warrior pen a source of heat and poisonous odor that would make sleep that night impossible. The staff of the 6th departed, and many of the legionaries drafted onto the incident's cleanup crew had left the area to sleep or go about other camp duties. Aileron was the last soldier near the pens who wasn't on patrol or watch. He had some time to kill before meeting with the Interfector like he was told. So, he spent the moments watching the pile of burning bodies and male Ajoan warriors packed against the wire, trying to keep as far from their burning friends as possible. As the fire crackled, and sobs came from the onlooking women's pens, Aileron gave one last look into the dim west before turning towards the commander's tent. As he walked along the wire of one prisoner pen, he saw the many dissolutes out of the corner of his eye and paid no mind to any of them until his peripherals happened to catch a lone woman standing and facing him right against the wire. Just as he passed by, he took particular notice of this and turned to look at her face. A young woman with tears streaming down her face and teeth clenched gave him the look of the devil. Stopping to study the woman and possibly put her in her place, she angrily sobbed the words, You did this." Aileron nodded and thought, "It'd be against my position to accept glory, credit, and recognition for the work of Mars alone," and walked along. Power. The next morning. Sure, I don't see why not. Actually, hang on. Centurion Gallio. said the Interfector of Phoenix as Alaron still sat silently across from the man. Yes, Primus, said the tall armored centurion leaning on his thermic lance beside the desk. The Interfector asked plainly, is it normal for members of your staff to have their own personal servants? The Prime Legionary named Dalton adjusted his shoulder plate idly as Centurion Gallio responded. It isn't unheard of, just unusual, although it is somewhat extraordinary considering the fact there are all captures out there. The killer paused for a long moment and looked at Alaron briefly before turning back to the Centurion and asking, what's the going rate for captures? That depends, said Gallio before continuing. Back up north, the rate was around 2 aureus, but I received word from our forces in this region that places like Tucson don't even have a price. The markets near Tucson won't even buy captures from us, and are only interested in conditioned slaves, which are currently selling at approximately 4 aurii, additional denarii, vary per slave. Captures don't even have a price out here according to my runners. I see, said the Interfector before shifting his eyes back to Alaron. Why is it you want to purchase an Ajoan capture? Alaron replied militarily as usual to the inquiry. My new position has me as your side most hours of the day, Primus. I wish to purchase a servant to take care of encampment duties on the march so my time can be better utilized by your authority. The murderer sat silently for a moment before saying, sure you don't want to wait until we reach our next outpost on the southeast front. Makes more sense to get a slave rather than a capture for such a task. I am no stranger to conditioning those who belong to Caesar, even on the march, Lord Interfector, said Alaron. It was then that a smile crept across the face of the elite centurion before he said to Alaron, oh, I understand. A pretty little thing and those pens caught your eye and you wished to purchase that beauty. Am I right? The Prime beside the Interfector seemed to be holding back something of a smile. Alaron couldn't understand the expression since he was more focused on the question. I intend to use the capture for exactly as I described, my Primus. The Interfector's smile grew only a little wider. It's all right, Alaron. I gotta say I've heard more romantic love stories before. What's her name? Said the elite in a cutesy manner that was only puzzling to everyone in the room except the Interfector and the young Prime. Alaron replied flatly, her name is irrelevant, Lord Interfector. I will assign the capture a new name. The elite was about to say something else when Centurion Therakos entered the Interfector's command tent. Upon entry, the commander of the 6th century was about to say something when the killer caught Therakos first. There you are, Centurion Therakos. I must ask you something. Does anyone in your staff have a personal servant? Centurion Therakos paused in his tracks and responded. Just Decanus Montano. He has that little pet of his, Cara, or Clara, I believe he calls her. And since he was only recently put under your staff, do you have any misgivings about his servant, due to his placement in your guard? Asked the Interfector. No, Primus, I see no issue, provided Montano keeps her in her place. Turning to Alaron, the murderer said with that joyful expression, I think that about settles it then, Mr. Alaron. Turning back to Therakos, he asked, now, what were you coming to report, Centurion Therakos? Therakos of the 6th said, my scouts reported back just minutes ago. Our relief force is only a couple hours out. They should be here before noon. Excellent, exclaimed the Interfector before turning back to Alaron. I have a moment to spare, so Therakos, you wait here and take your counts with Centurion Gallio. Alaron, you and I are going to take a little walk. Show me this little number that caught your eye. Alaron stood from the table, leaving the commanders in the elite's tent, and walked out accompanied by the Interfector and Dalton the Prime. Reaching the main pens, the three looked over the masses still packed to the wire and silent in their agony. The sun was barely glimmering over the mountains, and the sky was blue. That captive pen on the far end still had a smoking pile of ashes where the bodies of the warriors were piled. The hundreds upon hundreds of captured Ajoans were still sitting and waiting for that inevitable moment when the sun was high enough to do its miserable work on the people of this desert. Only a few more hours before the Legion backup would arrive and mark their lives' turn from sitting in agony to working in pain. Standing outside the largest pen, the one full of healthy female captures didn't look too healthy, considering the week of waiting in the elements. The young veteran Decanus walked along the pen like he did the previous night, looking over the faces of the ones who didn't hide. Alaron came to the spot he was last night, and there she was. The woman was in the same place as before, the only difference being how she was sitting when Alaron walked up. Alaron lorded over the young woman who sat there with the head of an apparently sick woman of her age lying in her lap. When the woman from the night before felt his presence right outside the wire, her face turned for the briefest moment to see it was him. When she saw Alaron's face, she started lightly brushing the head of the woman in her lap and asked the Decanus, "It's you, come to beat me." "This is the one," said Alaron to the Interfector. The murderer and his prime bodyguard approached Alaron and began looking down at the nameless Agion prisoner. The woman turned her face and tried her best to hide her face with her dirty black hair as the three sets of eyes studied her like a slab of meat. "You got quite an eye, Alaron. She really is pretty, despite all that dirt and filth," said the Interfector before turning to Dalton the Prime and asking, "What say you, Dalton? Looking for a wife, or?" Alaron interjected, "I intend to use her for encampment work, Lord Interfector." The woman still sat there, hearing everything and saying nothing. Neither man hearing Alaron, Dalton responded to his commander and friend, "I think I'm good on that front for now, Primus. I'll let you know if I change my mind." The killer chuckled to himself, still studying the woman as he said to Alaron, "I don't believe we landed on a price." He paused before adding, "I'd say the captive rate up north sounds about right, wouldn't you? 2 aurei and perhaps 10 denarii for the expenses of a campaign march." "My Primus is most generous," said Alaron as he withdrew his coin sack from his satchel. Drawing out 2 coins of solid gold and 10 smaller silver ones, Alaron would have called the deal generous and fair if it had been 20 talents that had been asked. The elite pocketed the money and called for a group of 4 legionaries on patrol around the pens. With the 4, the Interfector ordered the woman out, and a few extra guns came over to keep an eye on the pen being entered. The legionaries stepped over the downtrodden masses in the pen, over the dead who hadn't been removed, and towards the specific woman. Not one person in the pen tried to stop or obstruct them in any way, and the woman still sat there brushing the hair of the one in her lap. Even though she heard the whole talk and watched the legionaries approach, the strong arms pulling to her feet and slap of shackles on her wrist gave her a shock anyway. The woman's head in her lap fell to the sand as she was pulled up. Her face was white, and with eyes still closed as the new slave sobbed all the way to the entrance to the pens. She protested what was happening, but her struggle didn't amount to much when 2 men had her in arms and with 2 more spears pointed at her back. Alaron couldn't stop staring at the woman his new servant was caressing, and noticed she hadn't moved, while her face remained pure white. Flies began landing on the still woman's head and face as Alaron's new servant was escorted out the gate. The flies continued to land on the frozen woman's face, and one crawled its way between her lips. Alaron was brought back to the moment when the killer said, "Here she is, all yours, Alaron." Alaron turned to the Interfector. Beside him was the woman from last night, standing between 2 legionaries with her wrists bound in chains. Alaron looked to the Interfector and said, "Thank you, my Primus." Turning to the group of legionaries, Alaron said, "Take her to my private tent, beside the command residence of our elite. Spare no confines or restraints." The gaggle of legionaries escorted the woman away as she began quietly sobbing again without making eye contact with anyone. When Alaron turned back to the Interfector, he had his usual emotionless expression on his face when he spoke to Alaron in that cool manner. "Get her cleaned up and await your checkup from the healer. After that, report back to me immediately. There are a few things I need you to do before our relief gets here. So, I'll expect to see you again in, say, 1 hour." "Of course, Lord Interfector. I will see your orders done without hesitation." The Interfector nodded, walked back to the command tent with the Prime, and Alaron had one last look at the face of the still woman behind the wire. More flies were on her face, and nobody was there to keep them off anymore. Alaron turned back towards the Legion tents and started walking to his quarters. When Alaron entered his private tent, the woman was sitting chained to one of his little wooden chairs. He walked right past her, barely even noticing her existence, before taking a seat on the other chair next to his cot and beside a small table he'd saved from the Ajoan's wreckage. Studying the woman, she had stopped sobbing and was instead just staring at the ground with her dirty black hair hanging over her face. Silent and unmoving, the woman sat there in ragged and dirt-covered garb made of what looked like leather and what appeared to be burlap. A heavy piece of clothing resembling a sort of dress, given how the young tribal wasn't wearing pants. The thing might have looked very pretty if it wasn't covered in sand and dirt, or frayed from the elements and captivity after the fall of her people. Alaran remained quietly looking at the display before him, and she remained almost perfectly still when Alaran broke the silence. "Tell me, woman, tell me what you think your name is." Alaran waited for longer than he was used to before the woman slowly craned her head upward and responded, "You're one of the ones they punished." For the first time in at least a couple days, Alaran felt aware of the fact he still didn't resemble any of the other legionaries. He was one of two men still walking around the camp with only a wrapping around his chest and back. Though he covered it with his tunic most of the time, he had almost forgotten about the audience that got to see his punishment. It was also then that he felt his face again. His face had done a lot of healing in the weeks since the Ajoan's fall, and he'd regained most of his sight from his still slightly purple eyes. Still, Alaran didn't enjoy being reminded of his injuries in any way, and more importantly, the slave didn't answer his question. The back of Alaran's hand landed on her face the second the last syllable left her mouth. Not enough to truly harm her. The action was just to show her how powerless she really was, as her limbs were all chained to the chair beneath her. The shock of the blow was still enough to break a few tears loose from her eyes. Over the next few seconds, Alaran remained quiet, and the woman's tears got subtly louder until Alaran's voice penetrated the atmosphere. "I asked your name, slave." The woman winced at Alaran's loud voice, something that wasn't a shout or even loud in Alaran's eyes. The woman recovered herself just as Alaran was about to deliver another blow. "Gabriella. Gabriella is my name. Don't hit me," said the woman as she fell into more tears. "I will only tell you one more time to stop crying, slave," said Alaran coolly. The serious intent wasn't lost on the woman named Gabriella, as she tried harder to get better control over herself. Choking on the sobs, she was hyperventilating but becoming quieter as she tried harder and harder to gain more power over her feelings. She managed to maintain that control even when she saw the man across from her growing an increasingly more terrible look the longer she made noise. She'd finally done it and mastered her emotions despite the newness of her situation, and that only turned itself into rage, a rage that Alaran could see. "All right, not a bad name. I may even let you keep it." Alaran paused, awaiting some kind of response. The woman continued to tame her crying, barely hearing Alaran's words. When she collected herself enough, she was no longer hyperventilating, and the conquering of her feelings gave her a sense of power she didn't know Alaran could see, and was expecting. This confidence even gave her the ability to look into the eyes of the man who, quote, purchased her. Locking eyes with Alaran, Gabriella's face was still a mess, but she felt that making him look at it would be its own act of defiance. When Alaran had finally found her calm enough, he looked into her formerly sad but now flaming eyes and said, "What did you mean last night when you said, 'I did this'?" Gabriella was emanating a form of confidence she never knew she had, and felt an importance in her being that was equally foreign. She answered Alaran, "Why did you buy me?" A question whose answer was another but slightly harder backhand across her face. That surge of confidence was diminished almost immediately again when she felt the need to rub the sting, but couldn't since her hands were still chained to the legs of the chair. This powerlessness almost made her begin crying again, but that resolve was still glowing somewhere deep down. One more tear and Alaran would strike again. Gabriella knew this. She saw the blurry figure through her clouded wet eyes, and the fear of another blow mixed itself perfectly with the powerless but defiant spirit still in her when she shouted through hysteria. "I said, you did this. All of you Legion are the same. I can't believe you. You killed him." She was sobbing completely, not caring anymore about what Alaran would do. but still trying to gain control over the feelings, not out of adherence to master's orders, but to better channel her sorrow into that anger. Aileron leaned back in his chair, watching the woman collect herself from that outburst when he said, "I understand. The man my former senior killed, was he your husband?" The girl said, "He was my sister's husband, but you didn't have to." She broke apart as each word left her mouth, and Aileron didn't mind being directly accused of the actions the Canasgula committed. Aileron had never eaten human flesh, and wasn't keen on accepting any glory from someone else's triumphs. Still, the Decanus let her collect herself uninterrupted, somewhat admiring her tenacity to do so on her own. He asked her, "And your sister? Was she the one you were holding in the pens?" Not expecting these kinds of questions, it was still clear to Gabriella that these questions were not stemming from care of any kind, but she still answered, each word giving rise to more tears that she noticeably attempted to wrangle as she nodded. "Yes, you killed her last night too. Her heart broke when she saw what you did to her. Oh God." She was completely inside the head of her dead sister, seeing the exact thing she saw when she watched her husband get his head smashed and his brain eaten. All of that taking shape when she looked at the man across from her, bandaged and broken by his own leaders, yet eagerly participating in the terror. Aileron heard her last words and saw the chaotic mess of despair, anger, and powerlessness in her mind. He knew what to say. "Your sister died of a broken heart." The question coming off more as a statement than anything, Aileron watched the tears streaming down her face and saw that light of defiant confidence about to die again when he'd implemented the last action he'd learned when breaking a capture. He said, "Your sister was weak to die in such a manner. Good riddance." There it was. The flames blazed behind her eyes again as she looked upon the man belonging to an organization that had taken everything from her. Just as expected, the woman let loose a flurry of shouting and crying, intermixed with a question from before, "Why did you buy me?" and a new declaration stemming from the deepest parts of her soul. "Punch me, kick me, beat me all you want. You should just kill me. The second you let your guard down, I'll slit your throat in your sleep." Aileron sat there for a long while after her outburst, watching her completely expressionless. Gabriella might have even believed Aileron was scared of the threat, and the longer he was silent, the more she was able to feel like she had control of some kind. Her sobbing almost turned into a laugh before Aileron said to her face, "I suppose I have little use of you then." Feeling empowered despite her restraints, she sunk her head back towards the ground as she said, "You wasted a lot of money on someone who'll never bow to you." "Money has no value to me," said Aileron casually as he stood up. Still staring at the ground, Gabriella watched the legs of Aileron walk over to a corner of the tent and come back. When the man was standing in front of her again, she saw something leaning next to him. Upon seeing the dull gray steel of a sledgehammer, her heart began racing as he lifted the heavy block of steel. Her eyes followed the hammerhead all the way up as Aileron raised it until she was staring at the coldest and deadest expression she'd ever seen. She finally learned what her sister's husband saw before his death, a man in all black and red, ready to completely obliterate her without any kind of thought or remorse. She saw the image of Aileron sifting through her remains, playing and bathing in the mess until it's time for some other Legion task. She watched her corpse being burned in a pile of the dead, erased from existence, and possibly even partially consumed. Pictures of herself as a little girl and her entire upbringing flashed through her mind. She remembered the warm hugs from her mother, growing up with her sister, loving her friends and family in the tribe. She recalled her tribe's good times and bad times, times they'd prospered, times they had to run from hostile neighbors, all the things her people had overcome, and the trials she herself endured alongside her family. Then she saw the fires and the nights of assessment where her mother and friends were deemed sick and eradicated. She felt her sister hugging her for support after her separation from her husband, and then felt that cold head in her lap, dead from a broken heart after watching her husband get destroyed and eaten by the demons of Caesar. Her whole life of good times and overcoming bad times ultimately led her to where she sat, chained to a small chair. Alaron had raised the hammer above his head when it finally sunk in that Alaron was ready to kill her and go about his day. The image of that hammer landing on her head instinctively made her erupt into the worst outburst of crying Alaron had ever heard. The dam had burst and Gabriella was completely powerless and sobbing, unsure if she was even alive anymore. She hadn't even noticed when Alaron lowered the hammer and sat himself back down. Alaron picked up the folder of unit reports off the little table, not even reprimanding the woman for her piercing wails. He sat there going about his business, giving the servant time to realize she was still alive. Over the course of several minutes, the woman had come to the reality that she was intact, but still not knowing where she was. As she got more control over herself, her crying became softer, and there she saw Alaron, who'd almost forgotten she was there despite that sobbing noise he found more irritating than anything. When she finally came to terms with the fact her head was still intact, Alaron lifted his eyes from his papers and said to her, "My assassin-to-be certainly seems pretty scared of death." He watched her, and she found herself slowly looking up to face him, still defeated and still plagued by images of her narrowly avoided demise. She said nothing to the Decanus's remark, and another moment passed before he stated, "You said you wanted to know why I purchased you. Here's my answer." Capturing the woman's eyes in a way she couldn't look away from, Alaron resumed, "I intend to break you." The woman watched Alaron and shrunk into herself as he stood to his feet again, leaving the sledgehammer. She tried to look away as Alaron knelt in front of her chair, but his face was somehow dead center of everywhere her eyes landed. Alaron said calmly to the woman, "You are no longer a human. You are to be formed into any shape I want. All I truly want is to serve the Legion, so paying you any attention and dealing with you will always be secondary. I said I intend to break you, which means that from this point forward, you are to do everything I demand down to the letter and without any question or hesitation. How painful your breaking is, how much fire I use, or how many of your fragile little bones I break, is entirely dependent on how flexible you are. Is that understood?" The shackles around her feet were unlocked as she looked into Alaron's eyes. His face remained the same even as he unlocked her hand restraints. Sitting free in the chair, and with Alaron still kneeling directly in front of her, she felt the urge to attack him. She wanted to slap the bandages on his injured back and spit on him, before picking up that hammer and shattering his head. As the fantasy played out in her mind, her eyes landed on that hammer behind him, and a few more tears came to the surface when seeing his face that hadn't changed from that of a calculating murderer. Her eyes drifted from the hammer to him once more, and a few tears fell as she nodded in acknowledgement of his question. Alaron stood himself up, carrying her eyes with him, until he said, "Now, stand up. Fill that wash tub in the corner with water from my bucket." Her eyes followed his pointing finger until she saw the tub and bucket of water almost directly behind her chair. She watched Alaron take his seat back in his chair and pull up his reports when she slowly stood herself up. More focused on the papers, Alaron's eyes still caught the woman stand up and shuffle over to the tiny washing tub. She poured the water from the bucket into the tub slowly, keeping an eye on Alaron the whole time, not even sure why she was doing that until she was done pouring. Standing there with an empty bucket in her arms, she looked into the tiny washing tub and the few solid inches of water rippling at the bottom. When her eyes returned to Alaron, she saw him looking up from the papers as he tossed her a crumpled box of old-world washing soap. "Strip down. Clean yourself off. Now." His eyes fell back down to the papers, and he began writing on them when she felt her hands drifting down to cover her vulnerable areas. This vague but dreadful feeling she felt made her ask shakily, "Why do you want me to clean off?" The question made Alaron look up once more, and his emotionless face again twisted into that of a killer. Alaron said calmly, "I will only say this one more time. I do not owe you answers to anything. If I tell you to do something, you do it. If you don't, or if you question me, I'll hurt you. Bad." Alaron's face reverted back to its normal state, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment, still dripping with murderous intensity. The woman just started to move her hand to the button on her garb when Alaron looked back at her and added, I'll entertain your question just this once, since I feel it may clarify the matter. You are to strip down and bathe in that tub, because you look absolutely disgusting. You've been in those pens, sitting in the sun, and bathing in you and your people's own excrement for a whole week. You look and smell utterly terrible. Fix that. Strip yourself all the way down, sit in that tub, and clean yourself. Now. Gabriella slowly began undressing, trying her best to cover the areas she exposed with her hands, a task made more and more impossible as more of her body was exposed. Her attempts at covering were noticed, but ignored by Aileron, who seemed completely uninterested in the naked woman before him. The woman sat herself in the water and began cleaning herself with the washing powder and a nearby brush. A few minutes passed, and the woman watched Aileron as she cleaned herself and tried to keep as much of her naked self hidden from Aileron, who still wasn't interested. Sometime when she was almost done, she attempted to get around the question rule by saying aloud for the other tent occupant to hear, "He's just having me clean up so he can rape me later," thinking Aileron would acknowledge the announcement. Her speculation was also completely ignored and barely even heard by the man who continued adding the inventory list for the Interfector's unit food stores. When Gabriella was finally done, the woman stepped out of the now filthy tub, completely clean and cautiously trying not to draw the gaze of Aileron. As she reached for the dirty garb, Aileron said, "No, not that." She paused in her tracks, and Aileron pulled a clean gray cloth tunic marked by a red X out of a crate beneath his cot. He tossed the garment to Gabriella without breaking his gaze from the paper, and the woman caught it. Still standing there, dripping wet, she felt the fine cloth, wondering how long it would take for the thing to decay into the ugly gray tattered rags she'd seen on other Legion slaves. Just as Aileron was about to lose his patience at the fact she hadn't begun immediately redressing, both of their attentions were turned to the tent opening where someone was entering. Gabriella had no idea who the person was, but Aileron did. His frustrated demeanor turned to an ugly grin when he saw the new arrival. The person who entered Aileron's tent studied the naked woman before turning to Aileron and asking, "Who's the tight twat?" Aileron fell into that unfamiliar joy when he exclaimed, "Welcome, Grandma. I've been waiting for you." The elderly slave healer shuffled her way through the rest of the tent opening and scanned the naked tribal again. As she approached Aileron in his chair, she kept looking at Gabriella as the Grandma asked, "You bought one of the Ajone captures. Why'd you do that? Such a young thing, too." Turning to Aileron, the sixth Grandma asked directly, "If you wanted a gal for respite, I may not have the looks, but I got the experience, certainly more than that thing. Telling me I ain't your type, or what?" Aileron nearly couldn't handle it, and began turning blue to keep his demeanor and refrain from that terrible laughing condition that dissolute so enjoy. Aileron knew this, still seeing Gabriella standing there, and he knew she was hearing the whole thing. Aileron could hear it now. He saw the words on Gabriella's lips. Why can she ask questions? When the Grandma had taken her place behind Aileron and began removing his bloody bandages, he saw the face of Gabriella ready to ask that question. Grandma knew this as well, and Aileron told her what to do in that strange telepathic way Legion slaves, soldiers, and otherwise knew how to do. Just before the question escaped Gabriella's lips, Grandma shouted at her, "You gonna get dressed or what?" Gabriella attempted some sort of response to the confusing words from someone she saw as a fellow slave or comrade. However, anything Gabriella thought of saying was killed by the Grandma, who added, "Don't talk to me, trash. My baby boy here won't hurt you in half the ways I will if you speak." Immediately, Gabriella threw on the tunic and stood there while Aileron and Grandma almost forgot her presence. As Grandma began cleaning the wounds on Aileron's back, he stopped her for a moment and approached Gabriella. He picked up the water bucket and a clay jar, then handed it to her before saying, "Go to the well. Fill up this bucket for washing, and fill up the jar for drinking." Gabriella took the containers in her hands and nodded, letting a few more leftover tears fall. Just before turning to go about the simple duty, Aileron stopped her and said in a hushed voice oozing with murder, "She's earned it, slave. Don't go thinking I won't splatter your brain or hers in an instant if the mood strikes me. Remember that." Another tear fell from Gabriella's eyes. She nodded once more and left the tent while Alaron returned to the chair for his checkup with Grama. Perpetual March. Alaron took his seat after his new servant departed, and the Grama began her work on his wounds again. They sat in silence for a moment before the Grama resumed her normal character. As the Grama was about to say something, Alaron spoke instead. "You know you're not allowed to ask questions either, right?" The Grama shrugged as she wiped away some residue on his back. "You mean like, why did you buy a capture? Why did you do that, by the way?" Alaron couldn't help but grin despite her blatant disregard for his directive. Alaron said flatly, "I don't need to satisfy your curiosity, and I won't." The Grama asked, "Are you sure about that? I think you'd tell me if I asked kindly enough." Immediately, the Grama put a finger into one of the still open wounds in his back. She pressed her bony finger in the deep gash harder, and twisted her nail in the wound, causing a surge in pain that would make any other man with less masochistic tendencies scream in terrible agony. As she did so, she asked again, "Why did you buy a servant?" Instead, Alaron felt this pain, and almost winced when she twisted the nail. Alaron only turned his head towards the woman behind him, asking dryly, "Are you trying to torture me for information, Grama?" The elderly slave instantly withdrew her finger from the wound and continued her cleaning work. "Wouldn't dream of it, Mr. Aranon. Just trying to close this wound a bit before rewrapping." Alaron knew this was a lie, and that only made the man smile again, smile at the balls of that loyal yet strangely defiant slave woman. As she finished her cleaning work, Alaron said, "I have to report back with Lord Interfector once you're done, and I'm keeping the slave here till the lock order. Our reinforcements should be here by midday, so make sure nobody kills her during the pack-up, would you?" The Grama put her cloth away and began rewrapping his torso with fresh bandages as she said, "You got it, Mr. Alaron. I have to see Mr. Montano after you, but I'll ensure she knows what to do before the order." "Good. How is Decanus Montano, by the way?" said Alaron. Grama was tying up the spare end of the bandage before tucking it in when she said, "Healing up same as you, far as I seen. Clara must be doing most of his healing work, 'cause I ain't." "Wait, is that why you got a servant?" Alaron turned his head in curiosity at the slave's revelation, completely unaware of where her thoughts landed. Alaron still answered the question honestly as he figured it. "I purchased the woman for encampment duties, but whatever else I do with her is hardly your business." At that, the Grama stepped into Alaron's peripherals with the bottom of her long slave dress pulled all the way up to the hip, and the words, "It could have been," escaped seductively from her withered voice. When Alaron saw the exposed leg, he cackled in revulsion and hilarity. Instinctively, he caught his laugh, but the millisecond-long squealish noise that escaped before that could have broken glass. The Grama stepped back behind him, finished her work, and Alaron thought of how it felt stabbing a human neck to stop any more humor from escaping. Back in control, the Decanus asked the healer, "Would you happen to know if Clara is subject to regular servant protocol?" "Far as I know," said the healer, still grinning from nearly making the young Legion diehard laugh. Alaron didn't expect Grama to know the answer to his prior question. He then asked her, "Would you kindly give Gabriella the rundown on how to not get herself killed?" "If you say, 'Please,'" said the Grama, still feeling smug, "do so, or I'll gut you." "Please," said Alaron, now wearing a grin himself. The Grama swallowed hard, recognizing the cue. "That's better." Just then, the tent flap reopened. Grama was done, and Gabriella entered the tent, water bucket and jar in hand. Alaron's eyes told her to set the bucket down, and she did just that. And as he motioned for the young servant to step forward, he asked, "Did anyone give you trouble?" Gabriella paused. Her eyes shifted to the elderly slave for some hint on how to respond, and stepped forward. The Grama gave no hint, didn't even look at her, so Gabriella said, "No." Alaron stayed silent and gestured for the jar he told her was for drinking. She handed the jar to him shakily. He took it and went to drink, but stopped. He looked into the water, smelled it, and swirled it around, staring into the container all the while. When he was done examining it, he looked up. His eyes met Gabriella's, and he gave it back to her with only the words, "Drink now." The woman accepted the jar hesitantly as if not expecting this, and unsure if she was suspected of something or if he was being genuine. The woman lifted the jar to her lips slowly and began to drink, wishing Alaron would stop staring at her as she did. It was as if he was daring her to stop with his mind. He watched her throat, gulping down the liquid until he felt she was about done. She looked at him, wondering if she should keep going, wondering if he was going to make her drink it all. His eyes still commanded her to continue, and she again did just that. He's probably having me drink it all so he can punish me for not leaving him some, she thought as she continued drinking and watched the man becoming more and more monster-like despite not doing anything at all. When it was all gone, Alaron knew and said, "Stop." The woman stopped. "Turn the jar upside down," said Alaron, and the woman complied. Not one drop hit the ground. "Here," said Alaron, and the woman handed him the jar. Alaron stood with the cup in hand, and the woman recoiled as if about to be struck. Gabriella watched him as his attention turned to the old woman walking her way over to the opening, and he followed her. As the old woman exited the tent, Alaron called, "You'll be back for the servant, correct?" the grandma said. "You got it," as she left, and Alaron turned back to Gabriella. Locking eyes again, the woman looked away instantly as she said, "I got you your water." Delayed in her announcement by nearly 3 minutes, and an empty jar later. Alaron stayed silent by the opening for several long seconds, feeling the jar still in his hands before stating, "As if I'll ever trust you enough to drink anything you fetch me. I get my own drinking water." Not understanding what he was talking about, the woman still refused to raise her head as Alaron ran his eyes up and down her frame. Somehow, his words only made her feel the strange and bewildering feeling that she should do better next time, whatever that even meant. She didn't understand how she had a sister, a past, a family, and a tribe 30 minutes ago, to all those memories becoming blurred in so little time. Her memories were distant, her personality still intact, but the overwhelming image occupying her mind's entirety was that of the already dead man holding a hammer, and the feelings of those chains on her wrists that rendered her completely powerless to that fate. Over that image were the echoing words, "You are no longer human," and every thought that guides her actions till the end of her days would be darkened by her new life purpose. "Don't make him hurt you." When Alaron had taken in as much of her physique as he wanted, he said, "Stay in this tent or die. I'll be back," and walked out of the tent. Meanwhile, Montano stirred awake to the kind of image he thought he corrected out of existence, Clara's head lying on his chest, rubbing his hand, and staring into his eyes. As Montano saw this, he smacked the sleep from his eyes, saw the dirty but pretty face staring at him, and asked her, "What are you doing?" Clara cooed. "Just watching you sleep, baby." Startled by the words, Montano asked commandingly, "And who gave you that directive? Also, it's Decanus, or Sir, to you, servant. This is the field." She sat up as Montano did, and he swatted her hand off his as she said, "Nobody gave me the directive. I just like watching you sleep. You look so peaceful when you sleep." Montano heard that last part more than anything and took it as a personal insult. He immediately stood with fists clenched. Clara, still not having broken her love through to Montano, sat back in fright at the half-dressed monster. Montano pointed a finger at Clara and sputtered, "I am not peaceful, woman. I am the embodiment of war and hate. Haven't you figured that out yet?" Both remained uncomfortably silent until Montano collected himself enough. When Clara fell back into her old self, somewhat familiar with her man and his occasional outbursts, Montano began getting dressed for the day, throwing on his boots and strapping on his lower armor. Montano turned his back to the woman who on cue began unwrapping his torso. Going about her routine task, Montano was tying up his boots as she asked, "When are you getting another respite?" "Don't know. I hear we're marching to the fortress at Micah. I hear called Long Shadows or something." "Why?" replied Montano unconsciously. Clara asked, almost done with her unwrapping, "Is Micah Mountain near Tucson?" "I believe so. Why?" asked Montano, too busy with his stuck bootlace to realize he was conversing with the woman. "If it is, I'm sure you'll get plenty of respite time. We've been out here for months. You deserve a break after all of this with Thea Jones." I've gone whole years on campaign marches without respite. Just wait till we join Legate Graham's push into New Mexico, thought Montano. Clara continued talking to Montano, but really, to herself. I've always wanted to go to Tucson. I hear the hotels there are so wonderful and actually cleaned. I'd so love that, just to get some time with you, alone. Preferably in a bed. I really miss sleeping in a bed, and wouldn't it be amazing to sleep in? Not have to worry about waking up and marching all day just to battle someone. Remember how you loved me all cuddled up in your arms back in Gold Canyon? I miss that. You'd always wake me up just like Montano still couldn't believe it. You know who you decided to love, right? He thought in his mind as he tightened one of his shin plates. Just like that time in my kitchen. I thought you were so sweet. Always showing up after the moon was high and somehow always when I was wanting you. I know you don't, but I thought that was romantic. I only showed up at your residence when Lizzie Perez was booked for the evening, and you were the only woman dim enough to put out free of compensation, commented Montano internally. Clara continued as she started cleaning his back. Unlike that bitch, Lizzie Perez. Plus, I heard she was selling herself. Not me. I'd never do something like that. I actually like myself enough to not sell my body like some profligate whore, as you'd say. No, you gave me what I wanted free of charge, and then legitimately sold yourself into servitude because you're delusional enough to honestly believe I care about you. Montano continued thinking. Anyway, in Tucson we could stay in bed all day and not have to worry about any interruptions. Would you like to do that with me? Montano heard all the parts he cared to and commented on where he preferred. The end. Can't say that'll happen. If I get any respite, it'll be because the 6th is due for time at a breeding camp up north. The decaness knew the face she made at that, despite his back being turned because she stopped her cleaning for a second. Montano felt the eyes on the back of his neck, as Clara asked genuinely, "What are those?" I've heard slaves and some of the legionaries talk about those. Montano grinned as he strapped down the other shin plate. You still fall under regular servant protocol, so it's where you'll go if I die in battle, if not auctioned off to another officer. Seemingly somewhat aware of what she offered herself up for as a, quote, personal servant to a Legion officer, she scrubbed a mark on his back saying, "That hardly answers the question." Montano was done with his lower work and was waiting for Clara to start rapping again when he felt like toying with her. Sure, it's one of two places you'll go if I die in battle. Of course, you know if I trip over a rock or die some other way. You'll be accused of my assassination regardless of guilt, and killed outright. The woman continued to finish up her cleaning, more focused on dressing up a particular spot on his back than listening to him. She acknowledged him accordingly with the appropriate uhs, still hardly hearing. Montano, believing she was taking the bait, went on. Of course I don't have to review what you already know about personal servitude. So, the breeding camp is where you'll go to be used by legionaries as their plaything, with the eventual goal being your delivering of a new servant to Caesar. I wouldn't worry about that if I were you, though. You're pretty enough to be purchased by any officer in the cohort if I were to perish. I can't tell you my brothers are very gentle with their beautiful properties. As she rewrapped his torso, she heard the only word she happened to, and responded. You aren't going to die in battle. Montano continued to toy with her. You don't know that. I could die in a big Joan revolt before the backup gets here. Or I could be outnumbered and surrounded by the next swarm of tribal giants we face. If that happened, I'd most certainly die, and then your life would be utterly miserable. Almost done, she said again casually. You aren't going to die. Hearing the words again from that mouth made Montano feel the sudden need to offer his unprotected neck to the next tribal warrior he fought. He imagined himself being beheaded in the chaos of battle, and thought of his severed head wearing a smile since his final thoughts would be about Clara being ravaged by legionaries on respite till the end of her days. Fantasies of his own brutal end in battle danced dreamily through his mind, all images making him feel warm inside if it meant the young woman would be made miserable from the event. As he fantasized about his death and her life of pain that would create, he was snapped back to the moment when the woman added, I ain't going to kill you. You never met a tribal you couldn't take, and not even that Alaron asshole could really beat. Montano stood in a flash and whipped towards the woman who recoiled in shock. You will never speak ill of a Legion officer. His gaze full of fire, the woman cowered further into the tent wall, still not able to predict the outbursts of her man. Montano, narrowly stopping himself from pummeling the young woman to death, barked, "Is that understood?" Clara nodded and curled into her knees. Over the course of several long and silent seconds, Montano relaxed and unclenched his fists, making Clara ease herself down as well. Montano looked at her for a moment, contemplating Clara in general. No particular thoughts about her, just looking at her and feeling like he was staring at an undiscovered life form. Montano tucked the remainder of the bandage into his chest, and both turned their attention to a rustling sound by the tent opening. The Grama entered, looked at Montano wrapped in clean bandages, and said, "Looks like Clara got you situated." Clara nodded, and Montano replied, "Yes. Your assistance isn't needed. Leave." The Grama gave a thumbs up and departed as quickly as she entered, while Montano tossed on his tunic and reached down to pick up his chest protector beside the cot. As he threw the opening over his head, Clara spoke softly, "You shouldn't put that on. Your wounds are still healing." Montano felt the sting of the heavy padded chest piece made from blackened steel and hardened plastics. He tightened the studded leather core protector around his abdomen and straightened the spiked pauldrons on his shoulders. Feeling the armor and its weight burning the deepest wounds on his wrapped back, he acknowledged the woman. "Good. We're leaving today, and I love a suffering march." Helmet and face mask in hand, Montano began walking to the exit. Before leaving, he stopped and turned back to Clara. "They will call a lock order today. Don't leave your post when they do." Clara responded, "I heard. I know what to do. Have a good day." And Montano left. It was still the early morning, and the camp stirred to life. Many legionaries were out and about, most of whom were changing shifts with the previous sentries after only a few short hours of sleep. This wasn't unusual since the Interfector's forces were still incredibly understrength, and poor conditions for the soldiers only seemed to liven their spirits, unlike what it did to the masses in the pens. Montano walked his way over to the command tent of the 6th. Montano entered to see Centurion Therakos, speaking with Decanus Gula and the other 2 officers of the staff. Upon seeing Montano enter, Therakos walked over to him with Gula. After their standard greeting, Centurion Therakos said, "Decanus Montano, I see you in armor again. I was considering discarding you if you still couldn't pull your weight. I'm sure you'll wear the burden of your punishment proudly on the march." "There is no pride in any failure to Caesar, my Centurion. It is only an honor to suffer on the march to battlefield victory," said Montano directly. "You are correct, and that is why you were born to slaughter," said Centurion Therakos as he pulled up a leather harness from a nearby table. "It is because of that I'm putting you as my century's signifer." Centurion Therakos handed the harness over to Decanus Montano, who accepted the role with the words, "I am honored, Centurion." The Centurion pointed towards the command table that had the formation banner of the 6th lying in the center. The 3 walked to the table accompanied by the other 2 staff officers, and the Centurion said, "We leave soon. Get the last of your counts. Begin deconstruction and prepare for the lock order." "Yes, Centurion, true to Caesar," said the 2 staff officers in unison before filing out of the command tent with Gula. Montano began to go as well when Therakos said, "Montano, equip yourself now. You are my signifer, not my logistics administrator." Montano turned and saw his Centurion pointing at the banner on the table. Harness in hand, Montano approached the command table and saw the 2 connecting rods leaning on the Centurion's chair. The long poles were leaning there, weighed down by 2 severed and mummified heads sitting on the sharpened tops. Montano took the poles from the table, holding up the rebar and examining the heads belonging to the first 2 chieftains the 6th annihilated. His eyes drifted down to the banner on the table, a red downward triangular flag bearing the standard golden bull atop a red background, and just below the symbol sat the Roman numeral 6. Spattered across the whole thing was the dried blood of the people those chieftains failed to protect, and that of many more fallen people since the raising of the 6th. Montano slid the banner onto the rods and locked them onto the harness. He strapped the hefty rig onto his back, tearing into his wounds, and adding to the pain he loved. Emerging from the command tent and bearing the weight of the bull, that banner sat over his head for the camp to see. With Montano wearing the flag over his shoulders, shining gold, and covered in blood of the Legion's expansion, the order to march was called, and preparations began. Midday. The backup entered the camp earlier than expected, in the late morning, as nearly 5 centuries worth of legionaries from the reserve pool marched onto the scene. The mass dispersed and reported in with the Interfector. With the packing up of the encampment underway, a force of nearly 250 began the continuation of the Ajones assimilation, and the lock order was called. The lock order was just a standard procedure enacted during the large transfer of slaves or captures during a maneuver, and especially during a changing of the guard or unit replenishment. The entire procedure was centered around accountability and accuracy. As the soldiers brought out the slave beams, all unit slaves were sent to their ordered rally points to sit and not get up until the end of the order. Since there would be many captures and soldiers moving about during a shipment up north, slaves had been known to use the confusion to slip away. During a lock order, slaves of a unit were to remain in their assigned spots under continuous supervision and sit with their faces up to be recognized until over, or face death. The necessity of the order in this case was critical since the Interfector's cohort section was so undermanned, in the middle of replenishment, still packing up, and devising resource distribution from the conquest. Still, the Interfector filled the ranks of the 5th, 6th, and 9th, as the assimilation force brought the Ajones out of the pens like a machine. The beams were brought out, and each Ajone who survived the week of suffering was chained to the heavy logs, 5 on each side. Bound to the iron links, each capture was forced to uphold the weight on the march, a simple contraption that kept them from scattering while reminding them of the kind of burden they would forever carry. So, the column of log-bound souls formed alongside the bolstering ranks of the Interfector's force as the camp was steadily brought down and ready to move. With slaves immobile and captures resigned to fate, it wasn't very long before the soldiers were done and the 2 columns were ready to move. One column was ready to escort nearly 1,000 people into a slave life up north. One column heading south, full of fresh, newly equipped, and covered faces, all ready to bolster their brothers fighting in the southeastern front of the campaign. Decanus Aileron stood directly behind the Interfector in the diamond formation of his staff, completely armored, and face covered by black metal, feeling the pain of the heavy armor and field pack against his healing back. Decanus Montano stood behind Centurion Thericos, and next to his new senior, Gula, staring at the back of the 5th century before them and feeling the added weight of the bull on his back. With the sun at its highest point, the Interfector stepped forward without word. Aileron and the staff followed. A horn blew from one of the 5th's explorers, and the whole cohort section comprised of the 5th, 6th, and 9th centuries began their slow march into the south. On the same cue, the Ajones began their escorted march into the Legion-tamed north, burdened and at gunpoint. On the march, Aileron walked in the footsteps of the elite, while Montano marched under the weight of the bull. How stories spread. Before proceeding with the story of Aileron and Montano, it may be necessary to outline a few brief notes about the Legion structure and situation during this time in their history. During this period, the Legion is believed to have been comprised of around 36 active centuries, the standard breakdown of mobile Legion forces spread across the Legion's fronts, with most of them focused on the New Mexico campaign. Started by Graham in early 2261, the bulk of the Legion's forces were diverted back towards their Arizona territories due to numerous incidents regarding their tribal allies and a series of coordinated attacks on their territories, most of which stemming from a post-war metropolis called Phoenix. With the unrest in Arizona throughout 2261, Caesar and Legate Graham eventually diverted their forces to surround the metropolis of Phoenix after dealing with a few tribal allies turned troublesome. Once Phoenix fell near the end of that year, Legate Graham, the Legion's Legatus Imperialis, took charge of the New Mexico front again while one of only a few select minor legates took the head of the push into southern Arizona. After Phoenix fell to the Legion in such an impossible manner, the event sent a wave across the lower half of the Sonoran wasteland that made many settlements and minor tribes bow at the first sight of Caesar's soldiers. However, there were still those tribes and raiders across the region who didn't care about that. So, The purpose of the Southern Arizona campaign was essentially to take care of the holdouts. In a territory that was largely Legion in name only, the Ajones had fallen, but there were still the Devil Dogs, Hydebarks, and several raider strongholds to deal with the Ajones being the smallest of the three hostile tribes. The legate head of the Southern AZ campaign, Legate Marius, was aware that the newest hero of the Legion was being commissioned to back him up. It was because of that, Legate Marius had the Interfector of Phoenix take charge of the forces he was bringing down from Flagstaff and wipe out the Ajones along the way. 3 Legion sentries had conquered bigger enemies, but the losses suffered by the rather inexperienced new Legion hero were unexpected. This was fine, however, since Legate Marius was taking things cautiously against the Hydebarks and prodding their abilities from the safety of the new Legion fort near Micah Mountain. Given license to construct the fort by the recently Legion allied settlement of Tucson, the headquarters of the Legion's Arizona campaign was only a few miles from the large post-war town. With a manipular garrison of 2 maniples for security and regional patrols, around 130 legionaries from the reserve pool, the settlers of Tucson were enjoying the perks of a Legion alliance, despite the non-negotiable laws they were now subject to. Still, life went on, and Tucson was more than happy to allow the Legion to build a fort nearby, especially since it was the only thing standing between them and the occasionally deadly Hydebark tribal raid. So there, Legate Marius waited for the man who'd be his new subordinate on the front to arrive with backup to bolster his 6 eager sentries. It may also be necessary to outline what exactly a Legion sentry is during this time, to better understand some of the words, customs, and characters you've been reading about. Using the 6th century as a quick example. Each sentry was led by a centurion, who had 4 members of his staff, usually all ranked veteran decanes who assisted the centurion in unit needs, disseminating information, and occasionally acting on his behalf. Alongside the 4 staff decanae, there were 10 others of different veterancy, each in charge of 10 legionaries of the same veterancy status. So a Legion sentry really consisted of 115 Legion soldiers. However, since most sentries sometimes had to operate independently, or had to march across wastes by themselves for days at a time, most were equipped with attachment forces. The 6th, for example, had a standard Explorer Group attachment, 8 legionaries who specialized in, and were equipped to act as runners, scouts, and standard combatants when necessary. The 6th also had a standard slave attachment, consisting of 15 slaves for the unit's assimilation work and to assist in unit labor tasks that would otherwise fall under the responsibility of the unit's recruit ranked soldiers. It should be noted that Clara and Gabriela didn't count towards the unit's slave attachment. Lastly, the 6th had an auxilia attachment of 25 twisted hair scouts and gunners who operated alongside the sentry. More on the auxilia shortly. As you can see, a sentry was really around 160 people all marching under the formation's banner. The unit acted as its own mobile strike force. It was small enough to live largely off the land, able to carry adequate necessities, could communicate with distant Legion forces through runners, was capable of protecting itself, and trained to assemble for offensive action relatively quickly. That isn't even to mention that attachments to a Legion sentry varied based on the objective of the unit. In this case, as the Ajones were marched north by a bulk of the reinforcements, there was even a surplus of auxilia troops added to the murderers' forces. It should be noted that this little detail about the auxilia was intentional on Caesar's part when authorizing the Interfector's backup. As the Interfector led his 3 sentries south to the fortress near Tucson, Legate Marius sat patiently at the head of the 4th and 5th cohorts making up the Arizona front. Though the size of each unit again varied per situation, a typical cohort consisted of 4 to 6 sentries. The 4th cohort, for example, comprised of the 5th, 6th, 9th, and 11th sentries. The 11th being headed by Centurion Lucania and occupying the long shadow fort under Legate Marius at the time. Alternatively, the 5th cohort comprised of 5 sentries, whose numbers aren't particularly relevant at this time, although both cohorts remained under the legate in charge of the front. Though the control of a Legion minor legate grew over time, the 2 cohorts under his charge were relatively normal for the era. Since sentries were almost always moving to and from battle or returning from respite or escorting conquered people into servitude, the cohorts were almost never manned by the chronological century sequence. With most of the Legion marching on or fighting in New Mexico under different cohorts, the sentries that made up each cohort always went where they were needed, something that was constantly changing along the Legion's endless fronts. En route to Legate Marius to become his direct subordinate, the Interfector of Phoenix was moving further towards the Arizona campaign's front with his 3 full-strength sentries and the previously mentioned Auxilia in tow. Caesar was well aware of his newest elite's reputation in southern Arizona, which is why he dispatched the extra Auxilia. This reputation was not one he earned at Phoenix, but one he earned long before he even met Caesar. Though the Interfector has his own story, Caesar was a smart man because he knew he had a unique individual who was perfectly qualified to achieve 2 goals of the Southern Front. That first objective was to tame the region. Not only was that being done through eradication of tribes, but also through easing tensions with people of towns like Tucson. Caesar had no desire to have to move even more forces down south, so coexistence with towns that allied with him was essential. However, he was aware that his doctrine and soldiers tended to make certain citizens in his territory upset. When white flags went up with the fall of Phoenix, so began the game of keeping them raised. This was what Caesar hoped to achieve with his elite's old reputation. Then, that second objective was to keep losses on the front to a minimum. He hoped to accomplish this by using the Auxilia whenever possible, something perfectly in line with the elite's new reputation because since the fall of Phoenix, Caesar's ranks had been bursting at the seams with new allies and plenty of Auxilia, all singing the man's praise. Before explaining how all this information is relevant to the duelist legend, it is important to clarify who the Auxilia were exactly. Even though the Legion had plenty of tribal allies and auxiliary troops before the fall of Phoenix, the wave of surrender that event created across the wastes led to those new alliances discussed. And with that came volunteer soldiers. Many tribes, settlements, and even several raider clans watched what happened to Phoenix and offered themselves over to the Legion, though exempt from Legion conscription and absorption into the Legion proper. Many minor tribal clans and settlements sent their warriors to bolster and aid Legion forces on their campaigns for perks from Caesar. Upon summoned, an auxiliary formation is dispatched to bolster a Legion sentry, where they are ordered into Legion colors and fall under direct orders from the centurion on how to aid. Even though the Auxilia are forced to adhere to a specific set of Legion protocol, the Auxilia stood out from the Legion ranks in a number of ways. To start, Auxilia could be identified by their lack of proper Legion equipment and dress. As stated previously, the Auxilia wore the Legion colors of red and black, sometimes even the standard black boots, black leather kilt, and red tunic. But Auxilia could almost always be identified by the tribal armor they brought from home, usually made of wood, leather, bone, and sometimes metal. It was the Auxilia's role in the Legion to offer their tribe's specialties in service to Caesar, so weapons were left up to the Auxilia unit's preference as well. For example, the Sixth had their attachment of Twisted Hair's Warriors, a tribe from the westernmost part of Arizona known for their scouting and reconnaissance abilities. So, many of them were barely equipped with any armor, instead just wearing the Legion colors and using ranged weapons when they weren't covertly monitoring enemy movements. Another notable type of Auxilia to join the Interfector's force was a band from a recent ally. The Atomic Stalkers were a huge band of raiders occupying the northernmost mountains around the former civilized valley, or what was considered the wreckage of Phoenix during this time. The Atomic Stalkers were at war with the caravans of Phoenix long before the Legion destroyed the city. And some say the raiders even helped make that happen since many Auxilia who came from them seemed well familiar with the murderer of Phoenix himself. Though the Auxilia came from many places and tribes, Auxilia were still considered separate from the Legion, and despite being under a similarly strict set of standards, the Auxilia were still very noticeable in Legion encampments. Most of the Auxilia standards may be considered tame. However, they were still subject to harsh rules like being forbidden to speak in tribal tongue under penalty of death during time in the field. This was an order installed after a certain tribe offered itself to Caesar and dispatched an Auxilia force to bolster a Legion sentry. From there, The auxilia used their language to communicate with one another to implement a plot to betray the local legion force. The plot was discovered, but not before the auxilia attachment killed many legionaries. After that, the tribe was erased for the treachery, and the mention of their name was made a death sentence across all legion land. Apart from strictly enforced rules like that, many auxilia allies had spent years alongside legionaries either back at home or on the fronts, all of whom spoke English. So even rules like that weren't too big an issue. Still, the auxilia might have been wearing the legion colors and fighting beside legionaries, but they weren't legion. That said, they had relatively normal behaviors contrary to most official legionaries. It is because of the auxilia's unofficial behavior that our story picks up. If you looked around a sentry's encampment during this period, you'd see most of the legionaries going about their duties, changing guards, and even resting around the campfire in an almost machine-like way. Most legionaries, whether recruits fresh from indoctrination camp or veterans on their 4th campaign march, are very good at adhering to the "you don't talk unless there's a specific reason for you to do so" mindset installed by brutal discipline. That isn't to say a legion formation is some silent mass in the middle of the desert. There was always some order being given, some legionary updating his commander on something, and some were even comfortable quietly sharing war stories by a fire during an occasional relief from duty. The kind of thing you'd see in the auxilia end of the sentry's encampment would sound a bit different, provided the auxilia tent groups weren't talking in their tribal tongue or plotting against the legion. Most decani or officers of the unit left the auxilia alone, especially since the auxilia again reported directly to the centurion or his staff. It is because of that and their relative sovereignty that the auxilia end of the encampment was usually loud. In any encampment, the auxilia were very vocal about the last battle they were in, boasting about this and that, and free to share whatever they wanted to share about what they'd done on the campaign, or lie to the auxilia replacements about the extraordinary feats they'd accomplished for Caesar. With the Interfector's days of leading his forces south and the surplus of auxilia tagging along, there were many loud nights on the auxilia sections of night camps that were all about the legion elite they followed, largely free from the stricter parts of legion procedure, and knowing who was leading them, many of the auxilia were delighted or even fearful of the murderer. Either way, auxilia who'd been there at the start of the Ajoan campaign told all the new auxilia about serving under the Interfector. They'd talk and discuss with the new troops how they felt serving alongside the recent legend, despite the week-long situation they found themselves in, with stories being shared about this and that, regarding battles and events from the start of the minor Ajoan campaign to the end. It should be no surprise that the names of the duelists were still fresh in memory. It was around the auxilia campfires that word began to spread about the duel. It was there that the story was born and where it would be twisted. Some auxilia were attached to the 6th during their long wait in Gold Canyon before the short campaign even started, and knew about that initial duel firsthand. Despite many of the story's events happening in private, the auxilia at least saw the public moments and heard enough word of mouth to develop their own iterations to tell their brothers in the auxilia. Of course, many legionaries in the camps would overhear the story or see parts of it firsthand, but credit for the duelist legend spreading falls on the auxilia. As more events were witnessed in the upcoming campaign, it should also be no surprise that the Legion's Arizona campaign eventually came to an end, and when it did, the auxilia and legionary forces who heard the duelist's story would disperse to other fronts and carry it legion-wide. At the time, however, and no matter how unreliable the auxilia storyteller was, every legionary and auxilia soldier who was on that march toward Tucson would know the names Alaron and Montano. Upon arrival, they all learned some version of how the feud began, heard about the Interfector's mercy, heard about their beating at the whipping post, then how some violent combative spirit manifested in a decanus named Gula, and how that spirit emerged under the message, "Glory to Caesar." Many more eyes would be on Alaron and Montano in the coming months, many of whom belonged to legionaries looking for an inspiring display of pain and glory, and many from auxilia troops waiting to see how the story continues.